Alain de Benoist, who is generally regarded as the quote-unquote leader of the French nouvelle droite, or new right, escapes political categorization, as is generally the case for all thinkers of any worth. Philosophically, he adopts a more or less postmodern mentality, rejecting any claims to absolute truth. Politically, he combines elements of rightist and leftist thought, such as, for example, proposing a kind of anti-racist nationalism, which he calls differentialism. His lack of affinity for what generally goes by the name right wing is demonstrated by the fact that in 1984, he voted for the Communist Party, a choice born out of his rejection of capitalism, liberalism, and American influence. As we can expect from a man of this character, his confrontation with democracy escapes all of the usual prejudices and arguments. This book, titled The Problem of Democracy, is at once a defense and a critique of democracy. The problem, as it were, is a modern misunderstanding and corruption of what democracy has historically meant. Modern democracy does not give power to the people, he argues, but instead control is exercised only indirectly, and it thus violates the principle of popular sovereignty. In the first chapter, he wrestles with the definition of democratic terminology. He notes that the common approach to defining democracy, which is etymological, is insufficient because the terms of the definition are today too heterogeneous. The word democracy means literally rule by the people or power by the people, as he writes. But what is a people, or demos? Classically, the demos referred to free citizens who were grouped into various administrative bodies where they held the power to make decisions. In Athens, one became a citizen only through birth, as the Athenians considered themselves to be autochthonous, or born from the earth, and thus endowed with a special superiority. Slaves were prohibited from voting, not because they were slaves, but rather because they were not Athenian and thus not citizens. As such, Athens was aristodemocratic, as classical democracies always were. This aristocracy had a special significance, as the classical idea of liberty meant to belong to a people or an ethnos. Adherence to the law, under which all Athenian citizens were equal, was also adherence to the common good of the group. A people, in this sense, means something closer to a volk. In various etymologies of the word, liberty, drawn from Indo-European, German, and Latin, refer precisely to belonging to a kinship group. Equality also differed from its modern democratic meaning, as it meant strictly the proportionality of qualities rather than the mathematical equality of qualities. As such, equality implied a condition of inequality because people could only be equal if they had the same degree of qualities. This is why non-citizens were not allowed to vote. They were not aristocratically equal to the citizens, and so they could not be granted equal participation in the community. We can clearly see that each of these concepts is closely related to the other. Democracy is ruled by the volk. Liberty means belonging to the volk. Equality means being equal in nature to the volk. We are thus very far off from the multiracial and egalitarian character of modern democracies, because this is a much more holistic conception. Benoist argues that modern attempts to define democracy are situated on a method that simply presumes that the word democracy should be defined in relation to the systems that have arisen in modernity. But he says there's no reason to prefer the modern system over the ancient one. There's just as good reason for us to center the definition of democracy around the ancient conception because the ancients were the ones who invented it in the first place. As such, genuine democracy is direct democracy, which Benoist believes can still be practiced even in highly populated states. Benoist then takes to task defending democracy from its critics. His first target are those who claim that democracy operates according to the logic of number. This includes people like Joseph de Maistre, Thomas Carlyle, René Guénon, Julius Evola, and some others. Benoist argues that these critics are, ironically, relying on a very individualistic conception of man when they make this argument. They are implicitly splitting the demos into its individuals, and then supposing that it is the exercise of individual votes which determines political decisions rather than the behavior of groups. To the idea of the individualist mass upon which these critics are relying, Benoist opposes the volk. Democracy is tied up with the spirit and the destiny of an entire people. It is the manner in which this group defends and asserts itself according to a common interest and sense of pride and belonging. Thus, democracy, in its truest sense, rather than being merely the quantitative expression of a mass, is instead the expression of the qualities of an entire people. Benoist rebuts also the claim that democracy introduces chaos and disorder due to its division of the multitude. He argues instead that democracy introduces a kind of uniformity. Benoist then tackles one of the most common critiques of democracy made by Tocqueville and others, which is that it constitutes rule by the mediocre. The reality, Benoist says, is that the people, despite being generally mediocre, do not select for mediocrity. Instead, just as they can judge art or cooking, can judge the competency of politicians despite themselves lacking competence. Democracy is thus, as Pareto wrote, a system for the selection of elites. Benoist criticizes the modern democratist notion that democracies are counter-elite systems. He agrees with de Jouvenel that democracies centralize power in the hands of a small aristocracy. The more modern version of the mediocrity argument goes that voters lack the requisite expertise and knowledge to elect the proper candidate for particular issues, and so politicians should instead be experts or technicians. Benoist states that this just poses the risk of democracy transforming into technocracy and thus becoming non-democratic. There is then the critique that democracy constitutes majority rule. Benoist attacks the notion that majorities cannot make good or intelligent decisions and argues that democracies always include rights for minorities to be considered or at least not abused. He says that it is a typical confusion of the right that it must be against minority rights, and he contrasts his position with that of a certain communist who argued that the majority must always be correct on democratic questions against the minority. In the next chapter, Benoist discusses the concept of representation, the role of majority rule, and the enforcement of pluralism. Modern democracy is foundational on the concept of representation. Voters select politicians who represent their sovereign power. In this, Benoist sees an alienation of one's sovereignty to the representative. Thus, representative democracy, or indirect democracy, is antithetical to the popular sovereignty which serves as the basis for democracy. Representatives tend to gradually deviate further and further from the general will, and their actions are really only representative of the representative himself. Thus, modern democracies tend to carry out the general will even less effectively than a dictatorship. Benoist contrasts representation to delegation. In delegation, a voter does not give up his own sovereignty, but rather delegates the sovereignty to a clerk. In a way, this is still a kind of representation, as this practice lies underneath the justification that dictators tend to use, which is the claim that they are carrying out the general will. But it is a kind of representation that does not erase the power of the people, since delegates are inured to implement what the people demand rather than what they want personally. This proposition is therefore kind of dangerous, but nevertheless, it is truer to democracy than our modern form of representation. Benoist states that majority rule can have two functions. Either it serves as a fictional unanimity, or it simply serves as a mechanism. In the former case, Benoist argues that this leads to totalitarianism and the suppression of political minorities. It is a case where the majority opinion is considered to be true. In the latter case, where a majority rule is a mechanism, this leads to pluralism, since minorities can always become majorities over time. This pluralism, Benoist argues, destroys the general will, since it devolves into differences in values rather than just differences in opinion. As such, there can be no generality at all to the people's will, since it is always heterogeneous. The desire to preserve pluralism has led states to restrict democratic rights on the basis that only the systems and institutions of democracy are democracy. This is done mostly to prevent the possibility of the popular election of a dictator or of a political radical. Benoist points out that obviously this constitutes a contradiction of popular sovereignty. If democracy is ruled by a managerial elite, then it is not democracy at all. Instead, it becomes a kind of tyranny. The same contradiction exists when so-called democratists argue that radical and anti-democratic speech should be restricted or isn't speech at all. This is obviously an abrogation of the principle of the equality of rights, and so those who advocate for this are not democratic at all. In the worst case, pluralism turns into multiculturalism and multiracialism, which further disintegrates the general will. Benoist states that pluralism is good in some things and bad in others. Thus, a democracy worthy of that name must restrict pluralism by maintaining the integrity of the Volk. A Volk has common values and a common destiny, and so it alone is capable of, despite the existence of minority views, constituting the general will. It is thus a solution to all of the above problems. In the chapter, The Crisis of Democracy, Benoist gives a scathing series of critiques against the modern system. Most of what he writes has become commonly known. I have delivered most of these same arguments elsewhere on my channel, so I'll only speak about these briefly. He starts by pointing out that modern democracies are simply oligarchies in which electoral success is determined by money, and in which parties simply manufacture consent for their candidates and platforms. The politicians are not elected by the people, they are anointed by them, as he quotes. The modern paradigm of politics is wholly inaccurate, according to Benoist. Polls assume that voters are rational actors who choose in favor of their rational self-benefit, but this isn't true because voters often display contradictory impulses and opinions on issues. Thus, polls and predictive models are terrible at predicting outcomes. He notes how power in modern democracies is not exclusively a function of politicians, but rather there are economic and media powers that contribute toward determining the outcomes of elections. Controlling the media means controlling democracy. He also discusses the phenomenon of the uniparty, which is caused partly by the confluence of bourgeois interests and also by the close nature of elections. Politicians have to speak and act very carefully to avoid losing the small margin of voters that it takes to win, and so politicians increasingly come to resemble each other. He then points out that there is increasing abstention in elections, arguing that political apathy is generated by the lack of influence that the people has on democracy under an indirect system, that the lack of imagination and grand politics in democratic politicians further causes apathy, and also that there's a tendency for modern democracy to devolve into voting against the worst candidate, which contributes to apathy. He then states that apathy is beneficial to political radicals, since it means that politics will be carried out by other means. Lastly, he attacks the notion of universal suffrage as well as elections. Benoist argues that elections do not grant people any significant power over the government. In contrast to universal suffrage, Benoist presents in the next chapter his vision for democracy, which he calls organic democracy. Organic democracy is based on decentralization and localization of power. In other words, it tries as much as possible to give the power of decision-making to small regional groups. Men are grouped together in local assemblies where they get to vote on issues and appoint officials. The basis for this democracy is the Volk, and consequently, also the ancient definitions of the concepts of equality and liberty. It is a holistic conception of democracy, which is based on the destiny of the whole group. In contrast, unlike liberalism, it is not founded simply on the notion that the size and strength of the government should be limited. He also further notes that mechanisms such as referendums should be used in order to grant people autonomy, especially plebiscites. In the end, how are we to judge organic democracy? Is a political atavism sufficient to alleviate all the various problems of democratic rule? Personally, I don't agree. Even during the time of Athens, democratic power generally devolved into simple oligarchy. It was never able to preserve the rights of speech, for which reason they killed Socrates. If we go even further back, even the decentralized democracies of the gens that Engels writes about in The Origin of State and Private Property gave inordinate amounts of power to merchants and usurers who exploited this power to exact crushing mortgages on farms and land. Even if democracy becomes localized, that doesn't mean that media will be localized or that the global influences that come down upon men will be attenuated. And further, there is no guarantee that such a system can transmit values through generations. It is likely that each successive generation will radically alter the form of the community, especially given how rapidly culture shifts in today's age of the internet. We do have to admit, however, that Benoist's vision of democracy is truly more democratic than that which passes for democracy today.